Today we are really excited to have with us Joshua Lau. He's an assistant curator at the Art Science Museum. He has been with them for close to 3 years, and over that time he has worked on a bunch of really exciting exhibitions. And today we'll get to hear from Joshua on his various experiences in bringing these exhibitions to life. Our Science Museum, as many of you guys will know, the iconic lotus-shaped building in Marina Bay Sands, has been around since 2010. And over the years, I've personally been really fascinated by a lot of the shows that they put on. They do really invite us to look at the world in a very different way, whether it's through the lens of science, through the lens of technology, through the lens of design, art, or even culture. But most of all, it's about how all of these different disciplines intersect and combine and come together to make even bigger magic. And so please put your hands together for Joshua. We can't wait to hear from him. Come.
Thank you, Gwen. Morning, everyone. Thank you for making it down so early in the morning on a Saturday. And for the sake of time, I'll just get into it. I'm Joshua. As Gwen mentioned, I'm an independent artist and an assistant curator with Art Science Museum. I've been there nearly 3 years now. But today I will be speaking a little bit about reinvention on a personal level, but also how the Art Science Museum, through its exhibitions, also sort of explores this theme of reinvention. So, on a personal journey, I am very much in the background of the arts. I grew up, having theatre training. I was learning acting. I wouldn't say I was the best actor, left that very early on. But then I went on to really do theatre direction, which I think I really was drawn to the idea of how are we really creating narratives for an audience and how do we put different elements together. I love theatre direction, but at the same time I felt that I didn't necessarily want to be bogged down by a specific medium, a specific discipline per se. And I think for theatre, so much of it is bound by the act of collaboration, which I think is great, but at the same time, you can't always be creating theatre pieces every now and then because it requires so many different parties. So I also then went on to study filmmaking and film direction as well, really exploring how do we bring narratives out through this other medium, through the screen. And when it finally came time for me to go off to do my higher studies in university, again, I was really toying with the idea of how do I really find my own voice and my own agency in the arts industry where, I love the mediums that already exist, but I didn't necessarily feel like each specific medium really fit exactly what I wanted to do, and it felt like I had to fit a certain criteria or a certain mold in order to be in the certain medium. So I then decided to study curation with no technical fine arts history. I was mainly in performing arts. So I went on to study it, but I think learning curation really then opened my eyes to realize that actually what I was really craving for was this desire for storytelling and how do I tell narratives through bringing different elements together. And from there, I also discovered that actually maybe what tied it all was this idea of writing stories and writing narratives, which really led me to develop my own practice of creative nonfiction writing, which I practice right now. And from there, I really sort of explored the topic of auto theory, which is a literary form that has its base in feminist and queer theory. And it's really about how do you write from a personal point of view and how does the personal form valid knowledge creation and how is the personal valid in the public sphere as well. So I think, yes, I studied curation when I was in university, but surprisingly, I guess, when I came back to Singapore from studying in London, I didn't necessarily want to pursue curation per se, because I think when I was in London, London has such a long history of curation and fine arts curation, and it felt like, all these institutions are putting out exhibitions and shows that felt inaccessible to a certain degree. knew what fine art creation is and they kept this narrative, but I always felt like something was lacking and it didn't sit fully right with me. So when I came back to Singapore, I took up the opportunity to join Art Science Museum. I can't speak for the whole local museum industry and scene, but I will say, now that I've been here nearly 3 years and I'm still here, what I've come to realize that I really enjoy about Art Science Museum as well is that they are really pushing for this narrative and this agenda that, when each exhibition should really be exploring themes of, for example, the human condition, what it means for each individual to navigate social, public, cultural spheres. And in exploring these topics, the reality is you can't really separate a fine art institution with a science institution, with a natural history institution. Essentially, all these domains exist collectively and they collaborate in our daily lives, and there really shouldn't be a distinction between them. And I think that is what I've found really drew me to this museum, because they're essentially merging all of that. And in exhibitions I've done, for example, Mars the Red Mirror, Frida Kahlo, The Life of an Icon, we try to bring as many of these different elements as possible to really showcase a more wholesome and collective vision of what we're trying to explore. So I will speak about a few exhibitions that I've done previously. The first one I want to speak about is Laid Bare Frida's Inner World. So this was a companion exhibition to Frida Kahlo, The Life of an Icon, that was shown in the museum last year. So the main exhibition was an immersive show about Frida's life and Frida's work. But here at Art Science Museum, we also wanted to explore a different side of Frida Kahlo. We wanted to show the woman, the human being that was behind this cultural icon. I think it's very easy when you think of a cultural icon that you start to dehumanize the person. But the reality is she lived a life, she had her own trials and tribulations, and the work that you see is just a final end, a final product. But really, what was the journey? What was her influences? And that's something we wanted to highlight. So we created this exhibition that really showcased her medical records from her time at the American British Cowdray Hospital, where she was in the last few years of her life. These were records that were never before shown outside of the United States. So it's the first time it's been shown globally outside of the United States. We showed things such as her x-rays, where you can see, for example, her spine, and you can see even the metal rods and the nails that were in her back for spinal fusion surgery. We have anesthetic records. We know the medicine she took before and after she came out of her amputation surgery. And the point of all of this, to really highlight, the medical science part of it, was really to showcase that there's a different way to look at the art, and to also show that, art and life, art and science, it's a two-way street. It's not just one affecting the other, but both sort of, bleed into each other. For this show, interestingly as well, I would say not typical of a fine art exhibition, we also approached a lot of medical professionals here in Singapore, so orthopedic surgeons, anesthesiologists, clinical psychologists, to also assess the records. And they themselves aren't super familiar with Frida Kahlo, which I think we kind of liked. So we actually gave them the medical records, and from there they actually assessed, what kind of conditions Frida was in and how they could sort of see those influences in her art. One interesting thing from this show is that we actually showed an orthopedic surgeon her famous painting, Tree of Hope, and immediately upon seeing the painting, he saw the incisions that she painted on her back and the way it was curved and the placement of the incision, and immediately knew she had a spinal fusion surgery. And he could tell that without having even seen the records, without having known Frida's story really. Another exhibition I want to talk about, this is more than an exhibition, this is the Art Science Residency. It began in 2023 with its inaugural cycle with French-Japanese designer and entrepreneur Cesar Jung Harada, who was based in Singapore at the time. The Art Science Residency was something that I led for the first 2 years and really gave a platform for multidisciplinary creatives who were exploring different mediums again, different platforms and different purposes And sort of the core theme is really how do we enact positive social cultural change. For Caesar, his practice was very much focused on climate change, how do we mitigate climate change, and his inventions that sort of blend science, invention, art, and how these inventions can also serve communities and should come from communities. His practice is very much based on the idea that it should be community-led, and these inventions should be going to communities to fuel a community and to give them agency rather than communities constantly relying on sort of multinational corporations. So Caesar, for example, if you see in the middle image, creates all these ocean-related inventions. That is a project called Proti, otherwise known as shape-shifting sailing. He first created this project in 2010 to help with the BP oil spill. He brought it to the museum and he invited a lot of the youth to also create their own versions of it. Not necessarily to replicate it, but he really wanted to lean on the children's imagination. How do they create boats that are biomimetic, that serve a purpose, that is also sustainable? And I think his entire practice was really surrounded around the idea that we need to really rely on imagination to really reinvent the way we invent and the way we think and develop technology moving forward. For one whole year, we turned the museum into a fabrication lab and invited different communities to come in and create all these inventions that eventually Caesar took and developed further, and we kept them all as open source technology. Because again, for Caesar, he has this idea of what he calls co-opetition, which is collaboration and competition. As much as there should be competition between ourselves to fuel development, he also believes that collaboration is so key in really getting us further. How do we work together to reinvent? If you see the image on the right, that is a project called Ocean Solar Hydrogen that was heavily tested in Bali, Indonesia, where he essentially was using a hydrolysis machine to extract hydrogen gas from seawater. And he would then store the hydrogen gas, in this case in balloons, and the hydrogen gas would then be used as localized, produced fuel for the coastal communities there. Again, his whole intention is to really give the coastal communities a voice, an agency, a power that they would otherwise not have if they entirely relied on multinational corporations. So this leads me into our latest exhibition, which just opened this last weekend, called Another World is Possible. So the exhibition is truly about reinvention, I would say, which is really, how do we reimagine the future as opposing a lot of the dystopian visions that we are fed from mass media, mainly coming from the Western world. And you look at cyberpunk, you look at Ex Machina, Akira, you have all these images of dystopia, cyberpunk, techno-futurism that are quite anxiety-filled, are quite chaos-filled. But we really wanted to get visitors to think about how speculative fiction, on the other hand, is really just a sandbox, a neutral medium that can get us to think about futures in a much more hopeful and positive light. How can we change our mindsets and the way that we imagine the future? Because for us to even begin building, inventing a new future, we have to first be able to imagine them. If you see in the top left, for example, that's a work by one of our co-curators, and he's also an artist, Liam Young. He created this work in collaboration with Australians First Nations artist, Natasha Wanganin. It's called After the End, and it reimagines what would happen in Australia in a post-fossil fuel future, where we're no longer extracting fossil fuels. So then what happens to all these rigs that have been built to extract fossil fuels? They're imagining them becoming sort of housing for coastal communities again, but also possibly even space shuttle stations for the Australians First Nations people. We, through the exhibition, really also explored different genres of speculative fiction that currently exist. Through our research, it was obviously inevitable that we had to talk about Afrofuturism. I think Afrofuturism is such a leading cultural aesthetic and movement that really shows us how speculative fiction, when combined with freedom, with liberation, can really allow a community to reimagine themselves with agency, with power, with voice. And that was sort of one of those genres that we definitely had to include. We also, really the heart of the show is really exploring the speculative fiction genres here in Southeast Asia. And we really explored three main ones, which was silk punk, spice punk, and island punk, that all examine East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacifics in terms of how they imagine the future. And I think what's interesting in our research was that we found that here in Asia, the way that we imagine the future is actually very different from how the Western world imagines it. Here, nature, technology, history, memory are very much embedded into our visions of the future, and it provides a much more wholesome, cohesive view. And there's this constant encouragement that we should be collaborating and working together. So some key works, for example, if you see in the top left image, we have this work by Thai artist Tholap Jarunsuk. He created a sculpture that looks a little bit like a chandelier, but it's actually a space shuttle, a space station. So he actually created this out of everyday objects from his Thai Chinese heritage, for example, tiffins, crockery, and the whole idea really is he's examining the idea of how important the role is of cultural memory, collective memory, cultural diversity is when we really imagine the future, and the role it plays. If you see in the bottom right image, for example, we have Filipino artist Leroy New. He is commenting on how a lot of First Nations dump trash in other countries, for example, the Philippines. But again, he doesn't want his community in the Philippines to feel as though they are tied down by the restrictions of current sort of social, cultural, political spheres. Instead, what he's done, he's taken a lot of this trash and made them into wearable sculptures that are reminiscent again of space travel, high technology, all with the purpose of really showing visitors that resilience and perseverance is so important when we really think about reimagination, reinvention, and sort of moving forward, respecting culture, respecting nature. Obviously, we showed different versions of different genres of speculative fiction, but we also wanted to turn it back to the visitors to get them to think about how do they start to imagine their own agency and their own role in reimagining the future. So we created a chapter that was entirely dedicated to video games. We created an arcade because I think arcades and games really allow visitors to see for themselves how their personal involvement and their own agency affects others and the environments around them. So that was one really interesting chapter, and then we moved on to the next chapter, which again was really talking about in the role of reimagining the future, of rebuilding the future with desire. It's also important to not just think about things based on possibility and imagination. It's important to also think about how can we actually create this world? What actionable steps do we need to take? So here we had different works that really resist that urge to feel like we should give up in a time of dystopia, but rather works that really persevere through it, show resilience, but also really highlight the fact that existing R&D and technology already exists for us to build these worlds. For example, we have a work by Liam Young called Planet City that reimagines what the whole world's population might look like living in a single city. It's not necessarily his desire, but it's more of a provocation, really getting us to think about what we desire moving forward and what will be demanded of us. And mainly also, when we rethink a future that we want, we have to really assess our relationship between nature, technology, and the human being. How do we navigate that? How do we recalibrate that moving forward? The very last chapter of the exhibition really looks at Singapore. And I think as a Singaporean myself, it was hard for me to acknowledge and see that Singapore has actually really embedded foresight, reinvention, world building into its national policy, urban planning. So here we really wanted to highlight, how that mindset is so embedded in the nation, in education. And we have multiple works that also reimagine how the modern city, the concrete city, can really be rewilded. And by that really, I mean finding a balance between modern infrastructure and the natural world. For example, the works that you see here on plinths, this is by architects Annabelle Tan and Kai McLaughlin. And they, for example, showcase the Singapore Flyer, a HDB block, Benjamin Sheares Bridge, but really getting us to think about, for example, in the future where we no longer drive cars, what happens to a concrete bridge? And here again, the same idea of rewilding where nature can come back in and you can find a new balance and a new purpose for spaces around us. So just to conclude everything, I think, for me on a personal level as well as, as a curator, I really see reinvention as something that obviously is self-driven and there's this desire for hope and positivity, but it's really not about starting anew. It's really not about dropping everything and saying we need a new world, we need a new society. It's really not about that, but it's really about how can we build something that feels authentic to ourselves, our identity, our journey, and oftentimes that involves, bring in multiple influencers, multiple mediums, and it's about sort of finding your own voice amidst existing structures and systems. But yes, thank you for listening so attentively.